Hello and welcome to Reporters on France 24. I'm Delano de Souza. In this edition, we head to Canada, a country known around the world for its high quality of life. But what is less known is the reality of the country's Indigenous population. They live a markedly different existence, filled with poverty, unemployment, and alarmingly high suicide rates. Their living conditions have worsened over the past decade, this despite criticism from the United Nations. The country's Indigenous people are paying a high price for past policies of colonialism.
Employment is the cornerstone of participation in modern Canadian society. Employment is not only a source of income, it is also the basis for self-respect and autonomy. For Canadians as a whole, employment level has improved in the last decade, although unemployment still remains stubbornly high even during relatively good economy time. Unfortunately, whether in good time or bad, employment among Indigenous people in Canada remains lower, and unemployment rate higher than those of population in general. Now let's see some data of Indigenous people's population and income.
Canada is the sixth most developed country in the world, according to the UN's Human Development Index. If First Nations were being measured using the same data, they would be 63rd, lower than Russia and Libya. First Nations are about 61% of Canada's Aboriginal population, which includes Inuit and Métis. That's just over 900,000 people. Now, let's take a look at income. Based on data from the 2006 census, 50% of Status First Nations children lived in poverty, compared to 17% for other Canadian kids. The median income for a First Nations person was a little over $19,000, compared to over $33,000 for other Canadians.
Indigenous people in Canada are much more likely to be homeless, hungry, and unemployed compared with non-Indigenous people in the rest of the country. Based on the survey of Indigenous people residents, only an estimated 57% have a high school diploma. 63% are unemployed compared with local people that only have 57% unemployment rate in 2009. In Canada, 87% of Indigenous people live below the before-tax low-income cutoff, where a family generally spends 70% or more of its income on food, shelter, clothing, and they are more likely to get involved with child protection agencies and the justice system.
This employment gap results from barriers to Indigenous people obtaining and maintaining employment. On the demand side, the location of jobs, structural change in the labor market, and employer discrimination impact on the Indigenous people's chance of finding jobs. On the supply side, health, education, and training, worker experience, and carrying responsibilities limited participation. Furthermore, poverty, poor housing condition, lack of transportation or driver's license, lack of childcare, or poverty literacy contribute to this large gap in employment for Indigenous people.
Human beings. Can the relationship be improved? Of course it can. Has enough been done in certain areas? No. And I've publicly stated that in the last, federal budget came down. Was I happy with the federal budget? No. Didn't do anything to close the gap. Were we happy with Bill C-33? No. Unilateral pieces of legislation developed unilaterally. So it obviously says that we need to develop a better relationship.
Just give me one thing.
There are existing policies in place addressing the specific issue of Indigenous unemployment listed on the Government of Canada's website. They include placement and recruitment opportunities for Indigenous peoples in their communities, career development programs, a student employment program, and an Aboriginal employee network to promote a sense of community engagement among workers. While these policies and programs are a good start, they leave many of the issues facing these communities unaddressed. One of the biggest barriers in remote Indigenous communities is a lack of access to transportation, whether that is public transit or a vehicle. It is extremely difficult to obtain a driver's license as there is not easy access to driver's training, testing centers, or even a vehicle with which to practice. These programs also do not address childcare, which is a challenge for Indigenous communities. There are many single-parent homes and little access to safe, affordable childcare centers in these communities.
Door is not 100%, so it's really...
I can see right inside. Despite being one of the lucky few in the community with a job, this is the best home Sugarhead can afford. With all those mouths to feed and a chronic housing shortage, this is as good as it gets.
So what's it like living with all those people in this little house?
It's pretty stressful at times, especially when you have kids crying all at once.
Only a thin layer of plastic separates the family from the brutal cold outside, and the inside is filthy, with mold, missing walls, and broken windows.
Falling apart, eh?
Not a good way to raise kids.
According to a report by the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board, there is an untapped Indigenous workforce worth $27.7 billion. Due to lack of income, education, and training, there exists a huge economic gap between Canada's Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. The report says that the Indigenous workforce is underutilized, and the creation of more equal economic opportunities could be the key to boosting Canada's economy. Gaps in income between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations reach up to $52,000. If all gaps are closed, the value of the Indigenous workforce would be about $8.5 billion a year. If the Indigenous employment rate is brought up to the rate of the rest of Canada, that new working population would be worth $6.9 billion. The underutilized population in Northern Canada has the potential to generate $1.2 billion. Finally, if the costs associated with poverty, such as social assistance and housing programs, are eliminated, that is $8.7 billion. Put together, this creates $27.7 billion, a 1.5% boost in Canada's GDP.
There are a number of economic models that can be applied to the topic of Indigenous labour force in Canada. One such concept is demand theories of discrimination. This occurs when the demand for one form of labour is lower than other forms of labour, resulting in lower employment and lower wages for that group. In this case, the demand for Indigenous labour may be lower than that of other ethnic groups in Canada. This theory may be what's observed in Canada's labour market, as there are significantly lower levels of employment for Indigenous populations compared to the rest of Canada. This labour market outcome could be the result of prejudice on the hiring firm's part towards Indigenous workers. As well, there may be a dual labour market, which places many Indigenous workers in a secondary labour market with lower wages and poor conditions. This may be the case as Indigenous workers are less likely to work in occupations that require technical expertise and more likely to be found in trade-related occupations. Another concept that could be relevant is education as a filter. For many firms looking to hire workers, education can act as an indication of productivity. Due to imperfect information, firms do not know how productive a worker will be when making a hiring decision. Firms may use factors such as education to provide them with a better idea of how effective these workers will be, and those with low productivity may be less likely to obtain higher education, as more skilled workers face the lower cost to achieve high education. In this case, lower education among Indigenous workers may be seen as a sign of low productivity, rather than a result of poor conditions or other factors that may impact the capability for workers to obtain a high education.
To improve upon what the government has put in place, we recommend implementing some more policies to improve the lives of Indigenous people and attempt to bridge this large employment gap. Firstly, we recommend the government invest in affordable childcare centers in these communities. This would allow residents to pursue employment further from home without worrying about the safety of their children. It would also create opportunities for those within the community to work in these centers. Secondly, we recommend the government implement effective public transit systems that will provide opportunities to those living in remote communities. This could be a system similar to that of other towns, or a shuttle service connecting them to industries and job locations outside their communities. Again, this would create opportunities for residents to work for these systems. Thirdly, we recommend the government connects with Canadian industries and incentivizes them to create more Indigenous recruitment programs. These would include the corporate sector, health sectors, and educational institutions. This type of program would open these industries up to an untapped labor market and provide Indigenous people with opportunities they would not otherwise be exposed to within their communities.
Additionally, we noticed that Indigenous people already in the labor force face difficulty when it comes to the workplace. There are several barriers to retention of Indigenous workers in public service. In particular, overly high expectation, discrimination, and racism and lack of recognition of skills and knowledge.